Good morning, good afternoon. Happy? All good? Good morning or just good afternoon, everybody. Very good to see you and to have you with us down the line. Now, the British economy, our great economy, it has a deadly, deadly addiction. That's the harsh truth. It's the drug of cheap overseas labour. And this drug, it's being pushed on every street corner by the Labour Party and by the Tories. They believe that this drug, this addiction, is good for the British economy. Let me tell you, today, it's not. And what we need is a cure to this addiction. And the cure is an employer immigration tax. That is the cure to this addiction. Smart immigration, highly qualified, highly skilled, can be a great thing. But there's a price to it. There's a cost to it. And the truth is, at the moment, there's no cost to big business for employing cheap, low-skilled, overseas labour. There's no cost for training. There's no cost for infrastructure. There's no cost for housing. There's no cost for health. There's no cost for transport. And the list goes on. So they're getting away without paying for overseas labour. That cost is borne by the British taxpayer. And the truth is that no other main party will tell you is that that is simply unfair. And what's the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that we have lower wages for British workers. British wages are depressed by mass immigration from overseas. And again, I put it to you that that is simply unfair. And it's particularly unfair for young British people, youngsters leaving school, leaving university. That's where it's unfair. Now, if I take you back to the 1980s and the 1990s, yes, I'm old enough to remember, we had real growth, GDP growth, of 2.5% to 3.5% per year. Yes, if it was less than 2%, people would get worried. If it was less than 1%, people thought it was a moral recession. Now the Chancellor gets excited at 0.5%. But here's the real point. We didn't have mass immigration in those 2 decades. And I'll give you the example of the 1990s. Real wage growth for British workers was about 2.8% every year. We're amongst friends, let's call that 30% over a decade. But in the decade leading up to the Brexit referendum in 2016, there was zero real wage growth. Surprise, surprise, that was the first real decade of significant rising immigration leading to what's happened in the last few years, where the Tories, after Brexit, they betrayed every promise they made to the British people, to ordinary workers, when they said we're going to bring the immigration numbers down and that'll help wage growth, and they did the opposite. They absolutely opened all the doors. So now we've got some 2.5 million people arrived in the UK in just the last 2 years alone, with no price, no premium paid. And so that actually has a cost to the British taxpayer. And it's simply unfair. So what we need to do is we need to incentivise business to say, actually, if you want to employ people from overseas, that's fine, but you've got to pay a price for it. An employer immigration tax because actually we want to incentivise you to employ British workers. Now, big business will say, oh, come on, Richard. British workers don't want to work, to which I say, nonsense. Before the era of mass immigration, in the 1980s and the 1990s, British workers were working, and we had real wage growth. So maybe, actually, it's you, big business, getting away without paying a decent working wage. So what happens is that big business makes ever bigger profits because ordinary workers receive lower wages. And here's basic economic theory, literally since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The basic economic theory, it's A-level economics. If you increase the supply of something, the price of that supply, in this case, wages, labour, the price of that goes down. Whereas if you limit the supply of it, guess what happens? The price goes up. And if businesses say, well, I can't afford the wages, then guess what happens? They invest in capital equipment to create more productivity. But our investment in capital and productivity is falling. It's a disaster. And the reason is it's too easy to be addicted to that drug on every street corner of cheap overseas labour. So how will an employer immigration tax work? Well, here it is, and it's actually very straightforward. Look, if you want to employ people, non-British passport holders, then we think it's perfectly reasonable that you pay a premium on national insurance. So actually what you should pay is national insurance of 20%, as opposed to 13.8%. It's about a 45% increase. We think that is a perfectly reasonable premium to pay. Now, of course, there should be an exemption for very small businesses, 5 people and under. And of course, there should be an exemption for healthcare and social care. That's the right thing to do. But here's what will happen. This will actually change people's thoughts and behaviour. We believe over one electoral cycle that this employer immigration tax will raise over £20 billion. Varies, of course, depending on how quickly employers adjust their recruitment processes. But £20 billion in one electoral cycle. Now, you might be pretty astonished that Reform UK, known as a party of creating high growth, reducing taxes, making work pay, you might say this is a bit unusual. Let me tell you what it is. It's fair. It's the right thing to do. Because what we need to do is we need to invest in apprenticeships, in young people, in training, in employing young people, in motivating, in developing. All of these things that have disappeared because there was no incentive for business to invest in young British workers. This is the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. Now, I know lots of people will say, hang on, Richard, you're going to destroy growth. No, we're not. There are 9.2 million people here in the UK that are economically inactive. There are well over 5 million people that are on out-of-work benefits. So don't tell me there's a shortage of labour. I think for too many people, work doesn't pay. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to overcome this addiction. Now, choice is a good thing. And businesses might say, well, actually, I really want that person over there. I'm happy to pay the price. That's fine. That is smart immigration. It works. You've got the option, you pay your money, you take your choice. But if you want to bring in people from overseas, then there's a price to that. Because this great country of ours, this incredible nation, we've all paid for it over decades and decades. So it's not unreasonable to expect you to chip in a bit. Now I know, the lefties, they'll whinge, they'll whine, they'll bleat. There's a surprise. They'll call me all sorts of names and that it's discriminatory. Frankly, my response to them is grow up. I think the vast majority of ordinary, decent British workers are sick of this pathetic identity politics that is designed purely to smear and suppress debate and discussion. I know some people don't ever want to talk about immigration. But what we want to talk about in Reform UK, and what I want to talk about, is how we get this country growing again, and how we help young British workers have motivation, get on the housing ladder. It's not fair, as I've said before, that because of mass immigration, housing rents, particularly for young people, have increased just in the last 2 years alone by over 20%. We think this is the right thing to do. But of course, Labour and the Tories, they're literally two sides of the same socialist coin. Why are they addicted to this drug? Is it because actually they want to cosy up to big businesses? You've got droves of MPs from both parties leaving Parliament. What are they going to do? Oh, funny that. They're all looking for cosy non-exec directorships on these boards of these big companies. That's the conflict of interest that they've got. They're the globalists. They are for the big multinational corporations. They're not for the British worker. And so it's Reform UK that actually is on the side of British workers. Interestingly, trade unionists agree with me. But of course, the unions themselves, well, they have to do the bidding of Starmageddon and the Labour Party. That's the truth. This is the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. The truth is, folks, it's only Reform UK that has a serious plan to reform the United Kingdom, to reform our economy. And this is a key part of it. It's time for an employer immigration tax. It's time for change. And this election on July the 4th, it's time for reform. It's also time to welcome my good friend, who I've worked with, campaigned with for many, many years. And we're looking forward to campaigning again throughout this election period. It's exciting. Sometimes, we never know quite what's going to happen next. But that's part of the excitement. I love campaigning. Knocking on doors, all of that. When people welcome you. And let me tell you what is out there. My good friend knows it, and I know it. Do you remember the old shy Brexiteers? There's a whole load of shy reformers. They're out there. Every day I meet them. That little sort of thumbs up, wink. Don't tell anyone. That's why we're going to do so much better than everybody predicts on July the 4th. And that's why with my good friend Nigel, we are going to surprise everybody, because this great country of ours needs reform. So I'm going to hope that the doors will open and my good friend Nigel will emerge. Here he is.
Thank you, Richard. Good. Excellent. Very good. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And Richard, well done. That is a bold, innovative policy. I can hear the multinationals wailing already, because you're quite right. We have become addicted to cheap foreign labour. We're 1 week into the campaign. Gosh, it's going well, isn't it? I mean, who's leading in the polls at the moment? Well, winning by a country mile is none of the above. And it's not particularly surprising, because nothing slippery Sunak says is believable. And as for Starmer, I try and listen to his speeches. I try and focus on what he's saying, and I simply zone out after a few minutes. In fact, the campaign is so dull that the Daily Mail today's big front page is about the disappearance of Lord Lucan, who went 50 years ago, and I think that pretty much says where we are with all of this. But it isn't just the personalities that are dull, it's the lack of real substance on debate. On economics, I literally can't tell them apart, and we'll be talking more about the economy, Richard and I, next week. But the really big elephant in the room, of course, is the subject of legal immigration. Now, of course, there's been huge focus on what's happened in the English Channel over the course of the last 4 years, and rightly so. And we talked about that in Dover the other day. But the subject that the two big leaders do not wish to discuss at all is legal immigration. You see, nobody in this country was ever offered the opportunity to vote for mass immigration. In no election manifesto were people promised that many millions more would come. And just to give it a bit of historical context, if we go right back to Windrush, and we go all the way through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, until Tony Blair came to power, net migration into Britain through that whole period of time averaged 30 to 40,000 people a year. Some years it was a little bit higher, some years it was virtually zero. And we could have said 25 years ago that of all the countries in Europe, we without doubt had the best levels of integration of immigrants into Britain, certainly compared to France, Germany, and many other countries. But something changed with Labour, whether it was just willfully wishing to rub the noses of the right in diversity, I don't know. But the doors began to open. And indeed, it was the Blair government and those decisions to open the doors that directly led to the Brexit referendum result. Up until then, talking about leaving the European Union was considered to be a fairly minor constitutional issue, but how does it affect me, Governor? Suddenly, everything changed. So that uncontrolled mass immigration period meant that from 97 to 2010, we had a net inflow of about 2.7 million people. I mean, an absolutely astonishing number. But it was all going to be okay, because we were promised in the 2010 manifesto. We were promised in the 2015 manifesto. We were promised in every single manifesto, including up to 2019. To begin with, they told us net migration would be tens of thousands a year. And in 2019, they talked about raising the barriers, raising the levels at which people could come to make sure we would not be reliant on cheap, unskilled labour. Well, since the Conservatives have been in power, net migration is running at about 4.3 million. So Labour opened the doors, and the Conservatives simply accelerated that trend. And they somehow think they can get away with it because the electorate haven't noticed. Well, they have. And I really do believe that this should be the immigration election. You see, if you ask voters what are their priorities, well, the subject of immigration on its own has gone from about fifth 3 or 4 months ago to second or third, depending which pollster you look at. So what are the big priorities of the electorate? Well, cost of living clearly is one of them. What greater cost of living is there for the average family, for an ordinary folk in this country, than the cost of either renting a property or the cost of buying a property? It is the biggest capital outlay that people face. Now, I was doing my best in 2015, in the general election, to draw an argument that said a massively increasing population meant we had housing shortages, and nobody wanted to listen. But things have changed. Economic report out just 10 days ago, saying that the cost of rents was up by nearly 30% directly as a result of the population explosion. And think about housing itself. Well, we need to build one new property every 2 minutes just to accommodate current levels of net migration. Think about that. One new property we have to build every 2 minutes just to cope with current levels of net migration. We're told more broadly people are concerned about the economy. And of course, GDP. We bow down to the god of GDP. GDP is going up, therefore immigration, mass immigration, is good for the economy. No. If you have more people in the country, it'd be surprising if GDP didn't go up. But what really matters is GDP per capita, and that is falling. What that actually means is that the average family, in relative terms, are getting poorer, and that mass immigration is one of the direct reasons and direct causes of that problem. But it's good for business, we're told. It's good for business. Well, if that's the case, why have our productivity levels sunk to a level that is almost unimaginable? And I say that because our productivity is now below that of France. And given what I know of the French work ethic, I find that very, very difficult to believe. So it doesn't work at any level. But the NHS, we're told. The NHS, that matters to people enormously. Well, of course it does, as we pump in ever more money and get worse and worse returns. But even there, a population increase of 10 million people ever since Tony Blair came to power has put intolerable burdens on the NHS. And I genuinely believe that out there in the country, people are beginning to join the dots. They're beginning to understand that this population explosion that we're going through is actually leading to a decline in the living standards of pretty much everyone that lives in this country. We are not, as a party, and no party I've ever been part of, anti-immigration. We understand that high-skilled migration into Britain can lead to economic benefits, but we are totally opposed to what has happened over the course of the last 25 years. We are confident that a clear majority of the British public feel exactly the same way as we do on this issue. We are certain that they have never, ever been asked properly at an election whether this is what they want. And who knows, if people start to understand what Reform UK is all about, and let's face it, we're a very new party. We don't have a big brand identity yet out there with the British public. But if over the course of the next few weeks, people start to hear about us, start to see what we stand for, start to see that actually we want to stand up for ordinary British folk, not, as in this case, the giant multinationals, then we might just surprise everybody over the course of the next 5 weeks. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nigel. So we're going to take some questions. We'll start with the broadcasters. GB News, I think, are here. Mark White, do you want to kick off the Q&A? Hopefully you've got a microphone there.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon.
Hi. Is it on? Try it. Give it a tap.
1, 2, 3. Hi.
Very good.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us along. With regard to this policy to try to tax employers coming across, how can you ensure that what you're not doing is taxing small businesses who desperately need a certain skilled labour from overseas, and also the health and social care sector who rely very significantly at the moment on overseas workers?
Yeah, no, great question, Mark. Thank you. Try again. Look, on health and social care, we've already said that there would be an exemption for that. Even the dog enjoys it. So there'd be an exemption for health and social care. And look, at the end of the day, businesses have got to make a choice. This is to create an incentive for all businesses above 5 workers to actually say, well, yes, if you can only find someone from overseas, understand that, that's a choice, but there's a cost to it. There's a price to it for the infrastructure for all of us, because all of us, over decades, we've all paid for it. So, and it's right, because in the 1980s and the 1990s, before mass immigration, we had much higher growth in GDP and also in real wage growth. That's not a coincidence. That's because actually, if there was a labour shortage, people invested in capital equipment. And so you had higher wage growth, higher productivity. And that's what's been missing. It's directly linked, but no one wants to talk about it. No one wants to admit it, except Reform UK. And that's why it's absolutely essential. So look, smart immigration, it's a great thing. The key to good immigration, smart immigration, is both integration and paying a fair price. And that's what we're saying. Who's next? Have we got our broadcast friends at Sky, perhaps?
Hi, thanks for having us along. Nigel, yesterday you gave an interview in which you said that you would be open to having a conversation with the Tory party. You said, what are they going to do back for me? So what would you like the Conservatives to do for you? Are you open to having some sort of deal with them? Would you join the Conservative Party? And Richard, what do you make of all of this?
This was a deeply sarcastic answer given to Harry Cole, the political editor of The Sun, on his new programme, Never Mind the Ballots, just to give you some context of where it was. And it's the old thing. I've been asked this for 25 years. For 25 years I've been asked, what are you going to do for the Conservatives? Why don't you stand aside? So-and-so's a frightfully good chap, you know. He was an Eton, really, he was. And actually, I think in 2019, we did the Conservatives the biggest favour anyone's ever done them. We, with the complete catastrophe of the May Premiership, we formed the Brexit Party, and within 6 weeks, we reduced the Conservatives to their most humiliating election result in nearly 200 years. And that led directly to Theresa May going. That was the first bit of very significant help that we gave the Conservatives in 2019. The second was perhaps more significant, and that was we withdrew 319 candidates because we frankly couldn't bear the thought of a Corbyn Lib Dem SNP coalition, a second referendum, an unpatriotic Prime Minister. We couldn't bear the thought of it. So in the interest of the country, we stood aside. That helped enormously, because it gave the nod, didn't it? It's OK to vote for Boris. It's OK to vote for the Conservatives in this election. But what has happened since then? And I touched on it earlier. The reason we got the Brexit result was that mass immigration was, hey, wait, hang on a second, this doesn't make sense. Right? That's why we got the result. That's why the turnout in the referendum was as high as it was. And be in no doubt, millions of those voters that voted for Boris Johnson had previously voted for UKIP and the Brexit Party. We were like a gateway drug through from Labour. And one of their primary concerns was over levels of immigration. They feel betrayed by the Conservative Party. I feel betrayed by the Conservative Party. I have absolutely no interest of any kind at all in doing anything with them. As I say, my reply was deeply sarcastic. You know, what are they ever going to give me? Well, the answer is 3/5 of 5/8 of very little. There is no deal with the Conservatives whatsoever.
And as I said on Radio 4 this morning, you know, in any form of life, but particularly in a really dull election, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having a sense of humour and a bit of banter. Let's have a bit more sort of engagement in this. So, look, as Nigel said, our trust has been completely and utterly betrayed. And it's a bit like the plumber. Good-looking chap, comes along, tells you he's going to fix the leak, disappears, and it still leaks. And he comes back, and he blames the pipe, and it still leaks. And then he blames the glue, and it still leaks. And eventually, you say, no, actually it's you. A bad workman blames his tools, and you get a different plumber. And that's why the Tories, who people have trusted, they've betrayed us all, and frankly, they need to be fired. Who's next?
Fair enough.
Thank you. Harry Horton, ITV News. A huge proportion of people who come to this country legally do so for reasons of study. Another huge proportion is for health and social care workers as well. So even if this policy was successful, wouldn't it only tackle a small proportion of legal migration to the UK?
No, actually, there's well over 4 million foreign nationals in work, according to, I think it's ONS figures. And look, we've always said there would be an exemption for health and social care. But again, I go back to the 1980s and the 1990s. Look, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it worked then. You know, when I was 18, friends of mine started the nursing profession, and they went straight into the wards under matron, and it worked. They didn't need to do a long degree and come out with 40 grand of debt. So actually, we know it works then. You've got to incentivise and motivate businesses to employ British workers and to train and invest in them. And what this whole last 2 decades of mass immigration has done is it's let big business off the hook. They haven't had to pay the price. And that's why we've gone so badly wrong with productivity. It's why we've gone so badly wrong with wages being depressed. And the net result is, you ask everybody in all the campaign events, everybody feels worse off. Higher taxes, depressed wages, everybody's worse off. So it's the right thing to do. And actually, we think that then businesses got a choice. And if you want to employ a really brilliant person from overseas, fantastic. There's just a price to pay.
Charles Hymas from the Daily Telegraph. What would be your level of actual net migration that you would like to see on an annual basis? And if, with your with workers that you're bringing in to those small businesses, would you keep the salary level at the current level of about 38,000 for skilled workers?
Yeah, great question, Charles. And I'll just pick up the student point as well that I didn't pick up there. Look, the reality is that about 450 to 500,000 people leave the UK every year. So we can welcome a similar number, including students, and actually have plenty of capacity there in order to welcome smart immigration. What we've had in the last few years is about 1.2 million people arriving. The country needs to catch up. We've got to create some economic growth. We've got to create some wage growth. The housing market's got to catch up. Healthcare's got to catch up. Wages have got to catch up. So we need a pause. We need to freeze net immigration, let all of that happen, and within that, within the universities, look, there's some great degrees out there, of course, but we have to be honest. And even Sunak has just admitted it. There's plenty of Mickey Mouse degrees out there. And I've spent a lot of time looking at this. And too many students are being frankly ripped off and conned with dodgy degrees that take far too long, and they come out with 40 grand of debt. It's the highest debt per student in the Western world. And then they've got an interest rate of about 7.3% on top of that. Unless you earn about 60,000 quid as a student, you never get on top of the interest on your debt. That's wrong. So we need to cap the student numbers. And I'm afraid, again, no one else will be honest about it. The truth is that actually many people coming from overseas are abusing our student visa system. And it is a cheap way to get a graduate working visa that gives you a cheap way to get a skilled working visa, and then you're here for life. And again, you haven't paid the price, the cost to the British taxpayer, and it's the British worker that suffers. So I hope that...
Richard, not to forget, on students, worth remembering that under this Conservative government, if you come here as an overseas student, you've been allowed to bring dependents. So you come to uni, you can bring your mum. And 125,000 people have done that. And now they say, oh dear, we're going to close the door. Look, do you know what? After 14 years of lies on all of these immigration-related subjects from the Conservatives, I don't think it matters what Sunak says now. Nobody is going to believe them, and quite right too.
Can I get two just there?
Cheers. Calgie from the Express. With all due respect, you're not going to win the election, and you're probably going to have...
Such a pessimist.
I know, I am. And you're probably going to have very little to do with the Labour government that Nigel and others are predicting. So is it better to think about any Reform UK policy announcements as sort of opening salvo for post-election Tory party reform policies?
Well, look, I mean, I think the point is this. You know, the election, I mean, I joked about none of the above, but I mean, it's perfectly clear that Labour are going to win the election. You know, when Sir John Curtis, who's hardly a rash figure, says it's 99% certain that Keir Starmer will be in number 10 Downing Street, I suggest we believe him. So the election's over. We know that, we understand that, it doesn't fill us particularly with joy, but that's where we are. So here's the question. Who's going to be the opposition? And I put it to you that the Conservatives will be in opposition, but they won't be the opposition. They can't be the opposition. They don't agree on anything. The party is completely split. It serves no real purpose of any kind at this moment in time. And worth remembering, they've spent much of the last 4 years, in fact, they spent more time in the last 4 years fighting each other than they have standing up fighting for the interests of the country. And in opposition, they'll be even worse. They pretty much all hate each other. They won't be an opposition. And what we want to do, and remember, this is the first big campaign that Reform has fought. This is a 6-year plan. All right? This is just the beginning. So we are going to get millions of votes in this election. And yes, I know that the first past the post system is brutal. But I've got a funny feeling that when your readers in a couple of Sundays' time sit there and realise that actually the Conservatives can't win and that really they agree with much of what we say and what we stand for, they're much freer to vote for us. And it's on that basis I believe we are going to win seats. Maybe not a huge number, but we are going to win seats. And we intend to be the voice of opposition to a Labour government over the course of the next 5 years. That's the aim, that's the ambition. We're being completely realistic about what we can achieve in the next 5 weeks.
And some people raise this point, well, it's a wasted vote. Frankly, there's no such thing as a wasted vote. That's offensive to democracy. I want people to vote positively for what they believe in, not what they're afraid of. And frankly, if you vote Labour or Tory, there's no difference. It's socialism. High taxes, big state, mass immigration. Just to your right.
Hi, Richard, Nigel, Mikey Smith from the Mirror. I'm here.
You were obscured.
One industry that I can think of that is struggling in the current climate and which relies quite heavily on overseas immigration is Britain's thousands of Indian restaurants and kebab shops. The average Indian restaurant employs 8 people, so wouldn't be exempt under your proposals. Are you both comfortable introducing a curry tax?
Well, I must admit, I do like to go for a curry, normally much later in the evening than I'd originally planned, if you understand what I mean. Well, you know, people like Cyrus Todawally, who's lived in this country now for a few years, has set up his own curry kitchens where he's training British people to become curry chefs. And this is really the point, isn't it? The point is to reduce our reliance on overseas unskilled labour. Now, clearly, somebody who's a qualified curry chef is not going to be in the unskilled or low-wage bracket. But what Richard's laying out here, it's about incentives and disincentives. And what we're aiming to do, what we'd love to see, are fewer British people of working age not working. And, you know, one of the ways you do that is to give them more opportunities. What is pretty sure about your curry example is that this policy applied would lead to an increase in wages and therefore a much greater temptation to become a waiter, a much greater temptation to train as a chef. You know, this is about a plan over a few years to get more British people back to work and to rely less on cheap, unskilled labour from abroad, which, and I'm pleased at last, economists are waking up to the fact this has actually been a negative, not a positive.
Martuzi.
Martuzi from Tusi TV. Just a quick question about, obviously, increasing tax in terms of national insurance on employers. Big companies, of course, are already bringing down the wages to get foreign workers. Aren't they just going to decrease the wages that they already do to bring in the workers to cover the cost of that increased national insurance? Are we going to get more restrictions as a policy from you guys to incentivize?
No, actually, I think the opposite. I think that the incentive then is, if they want to reduce the cost, employ British workers, train up people straight out of school, apprenticeships. Yeah. That's the point. It's very clear. It's designed to do that. And of course, like anything, you know, what you do in business, you introduce something, and then you monitor it, you test it, and if it needs a tweak here and there, that's what you do. What you don't do is refuse to look at something and change it. And so it's the right thing to do, and it gives the right incentive to all businesses, of whatever business industry they are. There's a price to it. It's just about fairness. I hope that helps. Just behind you. Hi.
Lucy Manning, BBC News. A 20 billion tax on business is quite a challenging electoral offer, isn't it? And Mr Farage, to you, didn't you raise the prospect of a deal with the Tories because that's what Reform UK needs to succeed?
We have absolutely no interest in working with a group of people who betrayed my personal trust, damaged my personal reputation by actually trusting them in 2019 to do what they delivered. And the reason this election's gone is those red wall voters are not, even if we didn't stand a candidate, those red wall voters who are saying at the moment they'll vote reform, they would not vote for them, all right? So there is absolutely zero prospect of any of that. I will, in future, not make any jokes when I'm answering any questions ever again. I promise you. I promise you.
Now, coming back to the point, look, actually, so you focused on businesses, but what we're giving is businesses the choice. If you want to pay more to employ someone brilliant from overseas, that's fine. But actually, the focus has to be on British workers. And it's now only Reform UK that is the party of the workers. It seems the main two parties, they're the globalists, the multinationals, that's all they're interested in. So if you want to reduce the cost, then train up great young British people. That's the right thing to do. It's, again, it's what used to happen. And it succeeded. So why don't we actually trust what works? Hi, lady just there.
Hi, Julia Atherley from The Sun. You came on our show yesterday and said comments which you now say were deeply sarcastic. I wonder, was there a conversation, a very terse conversation, which happened yesterday between the two of you? Obviously now you're calling it banter and deeply sarcastic.
I'm really very sorry. Unless there's something Richard hasn't told me, we seem to be getting on reasonably well. And you can try as hard as you like, but you won't get a cigarette paper between us, I promise you. And, never mind the ballots. I mean, it's an out there programme. A couple of sentences after I'd given that half-jokey answer, I said to Ian Duncan Smith, you've betrayed our trust. It doesn't take much working out where I really stand on this.
I hope that helps. Just to your
Unless there is something you haven't told me.
Absolutely not. Hang on.
Just thought I'd ask.
Not a cigarette paper, even though I'm not a smoker.
Hi, Richard Wheeler from the Press Association. A question to you, Richard, just on the policy. What's the working assumption of businesses that will actually react to it and pay the tax? Some might just look at it and say, well, it's actually cheaper to say, I'll pay this national insurance premium because I've got the skilled worker already rather than training someone up. And to Nigel, Richard talked about shy reformers. Why are they shy?
So look, actually, that's the whole point of it. You give businesses the choice. And if that's what they decide to do, great. That's how markets work. And if that generates the number that we mentioned, 20 billion plus, then we've got a lot of money to invest in actually apprenticeships, developing, growing, enthusing young people, and getting young people back into work, off benefits. And one should not ignore that if we get 1 million people off benefits, 2 million people off benefits, the taxpayer benefits by tens of billions of pounds every year. And that's a massive thing that, again, the big two main parties, they don't really want to talk about. But the right thing to do for government is to look after the interests of British citizens. And we're absolutely committed to that. Seems to me the main two parties rather ignoring that.
Why were there shy Brexiteers in the run-up to the referendum? Why were there, and still are there, shy Trump voters? And why are there shy reformers? Because when I go on to Sky News on a Sunday morning and talk to Trevor Phillips and talk about a deep sense of unease that a huge number of people feel when they see the beginnings of sectarian politics in our country, people voting purely on religious lines, with women excluded, they ask themselves, what the hell is going on? How has women's participation in democracy gone back 100 years? Why is it we've got people chanting quite aggressively outside polling stations when they've won? What has gone wrong? And I raised that question. And if anyone knows the answer, please tell me. But why is it that a growing number of 18 to 24-year-olds in those inner cities who were born in this country are being attracted to extremism? 23% of young British Muslims think jihad is an acceptable concept. Now, that's a real worry. And I raised that not because I want to see division. That division is being felt, I think, with the Jewish community in our country already. I raise that because I think we ought to have a debate about it. I genuinely do think we should have a debate about it. But of course, I get called, all the names under the sun for daring to raise the issue. That's why when pollsters or anybody else asks people whether they support reform, they're shy about it. They're shy of getting abuse.
Just got you there and then to your right. Yeah, perfect.
Thanks, Ben Quinn from The Guardian. Mr. Farage, how do you square your concern about the rise of sectarian politics and your concern for women's rights with support for a man who openly boasts about sexually assaulting women and is under investigation for fomenting insurrection?
Yeah, well, I think the comments that Trump made, and you're going back a long time now, but the comments Trump made were, as he described it, locker room talk. And I bet, Ben, you've said one or two things to your mates in the pub that you'd rather not be aired in public. No, never. What a righteous soul you are, Johnny. Well done. You're the first person I've ever met. And if you get groups of women together, I mean, goodness knows what they talk about. So people do these things. Look, I know that you have a loathing, your newspaper, of the Donald. But I don't accept those comments you've made about him. I have to say, I think what is going on in New York at the moment is absolutely obscene in legal terms. But worry not, he will be the 47th president of the United States of America. And that's a good thing, to have an American president that likes this country, adores this country, feels a strong connection to this country. But perhaps more important than that, to have a world leader who did so much to promote peace. And I can just single out the Abraham Accords as being one example of what Trump was able to achieve in his period as president. I believe the world would be a much better, safer place with a strong rather than a very weak American president.
Just to your right, yes.
Yeah, Richard, another one of your policies you announced a few days ago was with regards to barbershops. I just wonder, I don't know where you get your haircut, but what was the issue?
Do you not like it?
Well, no, I think it's very nice, but what is the issue with barbershops? And you said you'd investigate them. Are we going to see Detective Chief Inspector Farage, or who is actually going to...
Did you ever get out of London?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you want to get out more, Sunshine. You really do.
Well,
you can see high streets with 5, 6, 7 barbershops in them. Thousands of new barbershops.
What's the accusation? I'm just curious.
Well, I'll tell you what the accusation is, actually. And I know it's true because you go to towns and people are saying shop after shop after shop. I mean, I don't know, maybe it was COVID. Maybe our hair's growing faster. Seriously. How come all these lots of these new barbershops, how come they've got no customers in them? How come they all want cash only? I'll tell you what the accusation is. The accusation is that these are fronts for money laundering, drug money. And someone has to talk about it, and someone has to have the courage to say that the authorities, they're either incompetent and don't know about it. I've been talking about it on a variety of broadcast channels for about 2 years now. And when I did, and you get the tweets and the texts coming in, they say, yeah, I'm in a small market town, and there's 5 new ones opened in the last 12 months. That's what the accusation is. And I think the police and the local authorities, they need to do something about it. Because I tell you, it is wrong, and it is the laundering of money. Have you noticed all the candy shops popping up? You look at the price of the sweets in them. A, they're fake sweets. I mean, I've literally gone in to test it. And see, they're fake sweets, they're disgusting, and there's never any customers in them. It's another money laundering front. We've got to be honest about this. So, look, I quite enjoy I'm very happy with my barber, but there's something going badly wrong.
And isn't it ironic? Isn't it ironic that in the last year, 140,000 British businesses have had their bank accounts closed because of the banks putting through, as they see it, interpreting money laundering directives that came to us from the European Union, whilst at the same time, this massive cash economy is growing out there. The whole thing's extraordinary.
Just behind you, yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Matt Dathan from The Times. Can I just go back to the employer immigration tax?
Yep.
You must have had discussions with Conservative MPs about this. Do you have much support? And feel free to name some names if you can.
Well, goodness me.
I love that.
No, we don't need to discuss policy with Tory MPs. I mean, obviously, the truth is a good number of them like our policies. and they realise that actually they're the policies that will get the country going again. But they just realise they've sort of been left in the wrong party. And that's what's happened. Hey, but here's the thing. Competition's a good thing. Choice is a good thing. It's a sort of fundamental conservative philosophy. The problem is that the Conservative Party have forgotten about it as they head towards socialism. And that's why actually a gap's emerged, and we're filling the gap. So.
Thanks, David Churchill from the Mail. As you've alluded to, a lot of business leaders will no doubt warn that this policy will cause hundreds of businesses to go bust. Do you think they're wrong about that? And would you be prepared to see firms go to the wall because of the extra costs it will impose on them?
Well, they've got a choice, haven't they? I don't think it'll lead to businesses going bust. Business has got a choice. And there's a cost. There's a cost to doing business. There's a cost to the British people. There's a cost to the taxpayer. So I think actually the whole point is to incentivise businesses that are concerned about this. Train up some young people. Get in touch with your schools, your colleges, universities. Focus on actually working with young people, get them on the payroll, make work pay, and frankly, we'll all be better off. Any more? Sorry, I didn't...
Thank you. So people voted for Brexit thinking it would bring down immigration. That doesn't seem to have worked. You can't form the next government, as you admitted. Isn't voting for reform just a kind of stress management exercise?
A great question. Well, look, thank you. I mean, look, you're right. The Tories betrayed Brexit. That's why they've got a big majority. And we gave them that big majority. And we trusted them. And that's the thing about betrayal. If you get betrayed, then you don't trust them again. And no, actually, look, as we all know, Labour's going to win this election. So actually a wasted vote, voting for Tory, you're going to get Labour. So you might as well actually vote for what you want, what you believe in, what you know are the right policies to create some growth. And that's for Reform, a party that actually stands up for the British economy and for British workers.
You know, I've got a history of standing in elections where, I think the first 5 elections I stood for in UKIP, if we even say the deposit, that was an excuse for a very, very major all-night celebration. But, people said, oh, it's a wasted vote. You're wasting your time. What's this ridiculous little party advocating leaving the Europe? No one thinks we should leave the European Union. Well, I'll tell you what, actually, in terms of achieving its goal, I think UKIP was one of the most successful political parties in history. And I want to reiterate the point I made earlier. We have a 6-year plan. We understand our brand is quite new. We understand not everyone knows we exist fully. So disengaged have many of the British public become and disenchanted in every way with politics. Our job is to provide an opposition platform to a Labour government that is likely to have a substantial majority. And if you look at this Conservative Party, I repeat the point, they will be in opposition, but they will not be the opposition. That is our goal for the next few years.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're done. Thank you very much indeed. We will...
Excellent.
Ladies and gentlemen.